Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan Austin, an interview with Eden Collinsworth, author of The Improbable Victoria Woodhull, Suffrage, Free Love, and the First Woman to Run for President. I'm excited to welcome Eden Collinsworth to the show today. Eden is a former media executive and global think tank chief of staff who has been the president of a publishing company, the founder of a lifestyle magazine, and the vice president at Hearst Corporation. And I once worked for one of their newspapers, so fun connection there. She is also the author of numerous books, the most recent of which is The Improbable Victoria Woodhull, Suffrage, Free Love, and the First Woman to Run for President, which was just published this month. Eden, you have done a lot of stuff in your life. What made you say, my next project will be a biography about Victoria Woodhull?
Yeah, no, I admit that I seem to be doing things in terms of my career in 10-year tranches. So I started to write books in my when I was in my 50s, and the books that I write are almost always nonfiction, and they cover a subject that I myself don't necessarily know about, but I'm curious. And so the one thing, I was a former book publisher, and so the one thing I'm confident about is that no reader is obliged to turn the page of a book. And so inevitably, to engage the reader, one has to tell a story. And in this particular case, the story is so remarkable. It was easy actually to have enough material. The challenge at times was the fact that this woman was so many things all at once that the way I conveyed it, had to make sense and work seamlessly so that the reader was just as engaged as I was when I researched it.
So I think some context will help us see truly how out of the ordinary she was. So Victoria Woodhull, she was born in 1838, lived to 1927. That's a lot of change to live through. What did life look like for the typical American woman of her generation? And then we'll contrast how different her life was.
Yes. Well, first of all, across the board, no woman had any legal rights. And so whatever ambitions she might have had were stymied, in every conceivable way. And almost always was the case that women had to kind of work through men as proxies, so to speak, either through husbands or, never did they have an opportunity to stand on their own. And what is really crucial to understand about Victoria Woodhull is that she was born, in the middle of nowhere, in an Ohio frontier town that was possibly, it had kind of one rutted road and a few houses and a general store. But the family was just profoundly poor. And there were 9 other children. The father was a con man. The mother was unstable and illiterate. And she was a hugely precocious little girl who began to kind of mimic her mother was a religious zealot. And so she began to kind of mimic the kind of outreach to the spirit world. And, whether it was by necessity that she had such a miserable childhood. I mean, there was no running water. There was very little food. The children were begging for fruit for whatever neighbors there were. She was physically and psychologically and emotionally abused by both parents. The father would beat the children for no reason, and the mother was, it was a kind of dangerous schizophrenic.
Oh gosh.
And so, it was very grim. But she was obviously at a young age extremely aware and cogent. She had total recall. She had absolutely no education to speak of. I mean, possibly she might have had, 2 or 3 years in a kind of interrupted way. But so she insisted that she was visited by a spirit guide. And again, whether or not that was the need to simply lose herself in fiction, or whether there was any validity to it, it's impossible to say. But the point I'm hoping to make is that she used this as a vehicle to put herself forward in the world. In that way, she couldn't be accused of being overly ambitious, and she became known as a public figure initially through clairvoyancy and spiritualism because it was the only opportunity for women to speak to the public. They had no, they were not allowed to do that either. And this was a period where, most especially during the Civil War, where there were scores of people who, in an unfathomable way, who were killed or dying of disease.
Yeah.
There was no way for either army to identify the bodies. And so the idea of mourning, became very esoteric because there was, and the more traditional religions, the kind of hellfire religions, were not particularly empathetic. And so what appealed at the time, and remember, this was a time of enormous change, as you've pointed out, where there was the discovery of electricity and the telegraph. And so there was, the thought was that if you could send signals through the air, by way of, then the idea of the, of the dead speaking to you in a very kind of life-affirming way was hugely appealing. And so clairvoyancy became quite popular, and it was almost exclusively women who were the clairvoyants.
Fascinating. So in an era where women are generally powerless, she starts off more powerless than most with her family and upbringing, but she finds this niche, this clairvoyancy. And from that, she is going to become a suffragist, a free love advocate, a successful businesswoman, a publisher, and a presidential candidate. So how do we get from clairvoyancy to that?
Yes, well, remarkably enough, it happened within a relatively short period of time because she insisted that, at the age of 7, that she was seeing spirits, one of whom was what she, considered to be her spirit guide. And he predicted that she would become wealthy, that she would live in a city surrounded by ships, and that she would become a leader of people. So again, whether or not this was, in an osmosis way, instilled in her, or whether she had to believe this in order to get out of, the little hamlet, by the way, was called Homer, Ohio, this tiny little hamlet. And, the fact remains that she was supporting this family because the father promoted her as a child clairvoyant. And so they would go from town to town, and they would also be selling elixirs, by the way, which was not unusual. I mean, it was interesting for me to understand that in times of great change, like that period of time, and one could say also like now, currently, charlatans or whatever you wish to call them are flim-flam mans, or they're men who have convinced large groups of people that they have the inside track.
We still have snake oil salesmen. They're just selling something other than snake oil.
No, that's exactly right. And so they would go, the father would promote her as a child clairvoyant. And, keep in mind, she was no older than 7 or 8.
Wow.
And they would move from small town to small town and operate, from the back of a wagon. And she would charge, a fee or, to sit with people willing to pay to speak to her, to the dead. And the mother would make up an elixir, which, was basically vegetable oil that was laced with alcohol and laudanum, by the way. So you would immediately feel better and want more. At any rate, she ended up supporting the family, and then she decided at the age of 14, because, the father was just unspeakable. And she had a younger sister, and he procured, her as a child prostitute
Wow.
for a period of time. He was a very nasty piece of work. And again, women and children had no legal rights or legal recourse. But she then decided to marry at the age of 14 somebody she met but didn't know, and she thought that it was, actually she had more of a chance in life to marry somebody she didn't know than to remain with an abusive father
Yeah,
who
it's an
she
escape
knew
hatch.
all too well. Exactly. And they moved to Chicago, so she was completely convinced that this was a city on the water, with ships, and that she would become,
Mm.
wealthy, and so on and so forth. Well, he ended up to be an addict, so
Yeah.
that didn't go well. And she fundamentally, struck out on her own and earned money, as a clairvoyant. And she made her way. She insisted that her spirit guide told her to move to Chicago,
Uh-huh.
which is very, very specific, proactive. And she moved to Chicago, where she met, or frankly, stalked or tracked down, the wealthiest man in America, Cornelius Vanderbilt,
Yes.
who also was a spiritualist, by the
Right.
way. And so he was quite vulnerable. He was quite a bit older.
Mm.
And she brought with her sister,
Mm.
who was staggeringly beautiful. I mean, they absolutely beat the odds, because in terms of the gene pool, because both the parents were kind of aggressively ugly, in addition to, being really ghastly. And so her younger sister obviously became his mistress,
Mhm.
but Victoria became an advisor of sorts, where she insisted that she, was in a position to advise him in terms of the stocks. Although it was quite the reverse. She learned a great deal
Mm.
by being in his, company, about stock trading. And again, keep in mind, women were not allowed
Right.
to trade stocks. But she did something, it was, I mean, you couldn't make this up in fiction. She took advantage of the, Black Friday, which was when gold lost almost all of its
Right.
value in a period of
Yeah.
hours. And what was happening was that the brokers who were using their stock as collateral to buy gold, when it crashed, obviously was sold off their stocks at an enormous
Yeah.
loss. And of course, it was the domino effect, where everything just plummeted.
Yes.
And so she sent men into the trading room to buy stock on the cheap,
Buy the
knowing
dip.
that in fact it would increase. And she became very, very wealthy
Yeah.
in her own right. And in a way that, again, is quite unusual, because, at the risk of sounding glib, I would take my money and just kick back and go shopping or something. But she decided to start a brokerage firm on Wall Street, which was unheard of. And she did very well, by actually dealing with women, which was, again,
Ah.
women were not, but she got she would advise them financially,
Huh.
and many of them were the madams. This was New
Sure.
York during, the Gilded
My wife
Age.
loves the show.
And there was very high class brothels. And
Oh.
so many of her the clientele were the madams who
Oh.
had heard all of the stock
Oh,
tips.
that's
So they would,
fascinating.
I know. And again, she was still in her early 20s. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary.
Now, one thing I love in your book is how you go into how she did the clairvoyancy and kind of the tricks of how they would con those people. So I encourage listeners to check out the book. It's really fun, those details of how she pulled this off and convinced people she was a clairvoyant. But she then gets into Vanderbilt's orbit, and that turns into a stock brokerage career. And then she launched the stock brokerage. But like you say, she doesn't go shopping. She then becomes a newspaper publisher. How does that come about?
Well, that was a vehicle, because she decided to I mean, this is the thing, frankly, I was grappling with for the entirety of, of researching and then writing the book. There's no doubt in my mind that she was completely remarkable. That's inarguable. She was
Yeah.
ambitious. She was driven. And, more and more she was interested in, I wouldn't call it self-promotion, but it was, she was very determined that she would not only get wealthy, but she would then become a leader
Right.
of just as her, the prophecy foretold. And so she decided that in order to cast a wider net, she would move into politics. And of course, it was absolutely impossible. Women couldn't vote.
Right.
In addition to which, she was too young. You have to be 35
Right.
to be a presidential candidate.
Yes.
So she wouldn't have been that age even, this was in 1872. She would have been running against Grant, and she would not have been
Nobody was going to beat Grant that year.
legal
Yeah.
age. That didn't stop her. I mean, obviously she decided there was a loophole in that you can put yourself forward, but knowing that in fact she couldn't vote and it was virtually impossible.
Right.
But in order to facilitate that larger reach into a broader audience, so to speak, she decided to launch a newspaper, and that was something that was hugely advantageous because, most especially at the time, the people who own the newspapers had a great deal to say as to not only its the ethos and their its political position, but it was a personal, it could be a personal outrage, not unlike Murdoch and any number of, I mean, not so much anymore, but his papers were decidedly conservative.
Right.
And at any rate, that said, the newspaper, which was a weekly, was incredibly forward-thinking, because what she put forward as a political platform was hugely progressive. I mean, in a way, you keep in mind that this was, just think of the timeline here. So she was, she proposed a one-term presidency. She proposed, she suggested the advantage of labor unions. She, suggested that there should be sex education for children.
Wow.
Yeah, she proposed an international court of justice.
Wow.
In other words, she was so out there.
Yeah.
And so, the paper actually became quite popular. And between that and the brokerage house, she did very well until she came up against Anthony Comstock.
And Comstock, we'll get to him in a moment. If the average person knows one thing about Victoria Woodhull, it's that she was the first woman to run for president. And I know that comes up pretty quickly after this newspaper publishing starts. So what is the story of that campaign?
Well, she was determined to speak in front of a congressional panel. And so she, to her credit, I mean, she had help. There were various, male politicians and intellects. I mean, she surrounded herself with an orbit of extremely accomplished men. And so just as she depended upon Vanderbilt for, financial support, she then depended very much on this circle of men who would help her curate her editorials. Sometimes they even would, ghostwrite them. And she uses them constantly as a sounding board. And so what her position was, she knew, obviously, there was no chance that she could be even on the ticket, really. I mean, that was a long shot. But what she did was she pulled together a kind of third party in terms of, the suffragettes and spiritualists who were very forward-thinking, by the way. They were, it was an interesting amalgamation of progressive thinkers that actually were it was emanating from the Northeast, and whether it was Thoreau or there was any number of or Walt Whitman, there were any number of very progressive thinkers and intellects. At any rate, what she did was she zeroed in on the amendment that recently allowed Black men to vote.
Okay.
And that was her pivot into, the what she considered to be the logical argument that women should also be allowed that vote.
Yes.
And what happened was the suffragette movement was always at odds with itself. There was one half of it that was determined to remain very collaborative, and there was then the other half that took a very fierce position of just tearing it down and starting all, it was kind of slash and burn. And during the Civil War, the suffragettes, including people like Susan Anthony, they had agreed to put aside that effort in order to encourage the right for Black men to vote. And so at the end of the war, they were hugely disappointed when there wasn't, the backup, so to speak.
Yeah, it's like, okay, now our turn. You got our back, right?
Yeah, not so much. So at any rate, and also by that time, Victoria was feeling hugely confident. I mean, keep in mind, she, against all odds, she made money on the market. Against all odds, she started a brokerage firm when she didn't have to. She, decided to run for president. And so when she came up against the suffragettes, the old guard, understandably, were very suspicious of her because she was a bit of a self-promoter. And fundamentally what she said was, I have proven myself, which indeed she had. But, hubris crept in. And so she was young. And so there was that. She had they didn't necessarily step forward to endorse her. So she often was the case, she was on her own. She made great strides, and she was an incredible, she would give lectures and speeches. And in that way, she was extremely compelling because she had learned from the preachers who would stop in the small towns and, under a tent. And, that there was a kind of wonderful ebb and flow of using the language, and she saw that it could, move people into almost a state, a euphoric state. So she was brilliant in front of, large groups of people, and she became a very popular, she had a lecture, she went on the lecture circuit.
Yeah, and you talk about that hubris. It makes sense. Most of what we talked about, this going from like meeting Vanderbilt, starting a brokerage, newspaper, presidential campaign, that happened in like 2 or 3 years. And you do any of that in 2 to 3 years, you're going to think a lot of your spells, especially if you have that prophecy at your back.
Yes.
Now, one of my favorite trivia questions has to be, who was Victoria Woodhull's vice presidential cabinet? I think it's a really interesting answer. So my question for you is, who was that Veep candidate? But also, how did they end up on the ballot? And did they even know they were on the ballot? Was this person part of the campaign?
It was somebody who I must say I have a huge crush on, and that is the great abolitionist Frederick. And so, he didn't know.
Frederick Douglass. He's just on.
Frederick Douglass. Yeah, I'm using his first name because
you're on those terms with him. Who's your crush?
I deserve to. Yeah, he was absolutely, another extraordinary human being. This was somebody who, I'm not, obviously people know his story, I'm sure, the general gist of it, but this was somebody who, at the time, it was against the law for blacks to learn to read. And as a little boy who was owned and beaten, he would somehow induce the boys that he would, his age, this was in Baltimore, to teach him to read. And he obviously was utterly brilliant. And so when the time came, he He escaped by taking a train north and, in disguise, and made his way to New York. And at the time, still, if you were identified as a slave who has escaped,
Yeah.
there were bounty
Fugitive slave laws. Yeah.
who made money by bringing these men back. And so the supreme irony, I mean, it's such a hideous reminder of that part of American history, is that he, in order to protect himself against that, he left for he went to landed in Liverpool in the UK,
interesting.
and then made his way to Scotland, where he lectured. And it was actually predominantly well-educated women in the UK and the church that then were able to somehow contribute to the fact that he could then go back to New York, and buy his freedom.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
it was not American money. It was, British sterling.
Hey, how about that?
Yeah, I know. It is incredible to think all of that was happening within a. At any rate, she was was completely, outrageous. She was audacious.
Victoria,
And so she just thought, well, I'm, slap his name on the front. And he didn't know anything about it, but he found out and kind of demurred. And, she never met him until years and years and years later, when he ended up in London. And she married, and that was the second part of her life. She was in her 40s and zeroed in on this very dashing, eligible bachelor who was the fifth generation of the Martin family, which was the oldest bank, including older than the Bank of London, England. And so she went on a European tour. And she, in a way that, again, is kind of remarkable. She met him in Italy, going. I know.
Romantic.
So I'm not quite sure what. She met Frederick Douglass in Italy. That was the first time they met. He was there. At that point, he was, recognized as the extraordinary man he was, and he lectured and so on and so forth. So he was traveling along with another American, which was Mark Twain, was very peripatetic. He moved around Europe a lot.
She gets to hang out with cool people.
Yeah. Well, she was made, I mean, certainly Mark Twain was aware of her because they both lived in London. And then I'll tell you another American who not only was aware of her, but used her in a short story called The Siege of London, and that's Henry James. And it was a very thinly veiled, story about Victoria Woodhull, who landed in London and married, was somebody who was very proactive and married a very wealthy or certainly into an ancient family.
Okay, so she puts Frederick Douglass on her ticket. He has no idea. She just does it.
Yeah, not
Now,
just to hear about.
How seriously did Victoria and the country take her presidential campaign? Genuinely think she could win? Did the country at all take it seriously? Was she on any ballots? Was anybody even able to vote for her?
Yes, she was, but it was at the time she was on the ballot. She was incarcerated, in a New York jail. Yeah, and that was the result of Comstock finally, a reason to. So we should.
Yes, let's jump back to Comstock.
He is also somebody who, that circumstantially reappears in the form of Elon Musk, who is somehow
Comstock. He's a guy who's passed a law that is you might have read about in the paper in the past year. It's kind of newly relevant. So remind me, who is Comstock? What's his law, and how's he get in this picture?
Right. So I'm obliquely referring to him because he, by way of Musk, because he was somebody who obviously was not a liberal thinker.
Right. Oh gosh.
And he believed that God had appointed him to identify the filth He wasn't popular. He was in the Union Army, but hugely unpopular because he tried to lecture his fellow soldiers on,
People love that.
the evils of masturbation, which is not really
Yeah, good luck in the
really
army.
not. Yeah, exactly. So he survived the war. He ended up in New York as a kind of their version of a dry cleaning salesman. But at the same time, he hit the streets and looked for. He went after what he considered to be lewd books in bookstores. And then he would, identify the various bookstores and the bookstore owners and involve the police. I mean, he was, he was very creepy, frankly.
Yeah.
And then he found a way of establishing a power base. And so he encouraged the young man's, the YMCA of all institutions to formulate this committee, that would also identify, what was considered to be, inappropriate literature and so on and so forth. And they were smart enough to realize this, this man was, could go rogue at any moment. Yeah. And so they suggested to him very cleverly that they would help him establish a separate entity. So it became a kind of, the Department of Vice. And he then, very cleverly, because he was shrewd, decided that if he didn't accept a salary, that he could weave himself into the Postal Service. And that became, that is a federal, it operates under a federal umbrella. Yep. And so he, with the backing of, church groups, he went to Washington and he lobbied Congress, and they then endorsed, what became the Comstock Law, which was such an overreach that it's very, very sobering to be reminded that this can happen very quickly, happen slowly, and then it happens very quickly. Yeah. And so he was able to, in terms of, he had his eyes on any number of people and things, including, not only bookstores, but medical books. And, the League of the Arts League in New York, where he didn't want nude models. And, so based on catalogs, he would go in and make arrests and, with the help of the police and so on and so forth. So with Victoria, he decided that it was actually a very stealth move. He deliberately had somebody order her newspaper in another state. Yes. And when it crossed the law, the state law, he then arrested her for distributing pornography.
Which was the Comstock Law had banned. So he gets this law passed, you can't send pornography across state lines, and then he has somebody order a newspaper article that was considered pornographic because...
Yes, because it was not pornographic. I don't know what it was his version of pornographic, right. And it had to do with it could have been anything, frankly, because it was simply a vehicle by which to arrest her. Yeah. And it was the entire newspaper, so it wasn't an article. The newspaper traveled across the...
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So she then spent time, in a cell, and of course she, was on the one hand, she thought that it would somehow further her cause. On the other hand, it dragged on, and she lost. The newspaper went under. The brokerage firm, suffered, and so and the election took place when she was. During the course of that incarceration, she got out of prison and really was in dire financial straits. Yeah. And she had, for having been in a damp cold space, she had, respiratory issues. And so it was difficult for her to lecture, go on the lecture circuit. And in fact, she tried to recoup the money that she lost with the newspaper and money that she would have otherwise made on the lecture circus. She tried to recoup that by way of Congress, So no, she was somebody who was astute enough to recognize any possible opportunity or remedy. But it was all for naught, and it happened, luckily, at the time. Vanderbilt was dying, and his family was very concerned that she would blackmail them, and so
Since her sister had been his mistress, almost certainly.
yeah, no. And that was something she learned as it's kind of a business model she learned from her father, who would, forgive me, but he would, make his daughters available,
Right. And then blackmail.
and so, but then he'd zero in on the wealthy men, and threaten them to blackmail them. So it was this kind of, 360-degree business model where you're getting money, initially, and then it has a shelf, it doesn't have a shelf life.
Oh my God! Yeah.
So they gave her, which was a huge amount of money then, and her sister, $200,000 to leave the country and pledge never to come back. And she landed in the UK, where she zeroed in on this fellow, John Martin.
Right. Back to Martin.
To his absolute horror of his mother, because they were very correct. And by then she had married, this would have been the third husband. And she was, at 40, you're kind of, you're not as fresh as you would be. I think, in China, they call it stale cake. There's a Chinese expression that at any rate, but she managed, she was so clever about it. She just moved into this position that she just, it was kind of a wife manquée, where she just decided she would treat him as though he was her husband. And she got her own engagement ring, and she waited for the mother to grow old. And it was just, she was banking on something and she ended up marrying him. And actually, they were quite happy together. But she became, for the first time in her life, she wanted to be respected and respectable. And she married very well. And so this loops us back to the beginning of the book, where, in fact, I do not start describing her. Describe the person among others, she is suing for libel, who was the head librarian at the British Library, which at the time was part of the British Museum. So he was kind of the ultimate British academician who literally lived in the museum, had worked, in the what they call the reading room for since he was 16, and he's, served a summons. He is the most upright, correct, man, and very principled, and he's served a summons and accused of libel, by an uneducated American woman who just came at him like a bat out of hell.
And she accuses him of libel because the library holds newspaper articles from the States that speak poorly of her.
Exactly right. What happened was that she sent somebody to the library to actually research and write a very positive kind of brochure about her, because she was constantly up against the British, the upper class, who, for all the obvious reasons, were very dismissive of her. And she wanted, to be respected and so on and so forth. So she assumed that if she could, describe in glorious, vivid detail her accomplishments in America. But instead, the man found these articles that described her vividly in a way that wasn't as positive.
Right.
And she sued not only the library, and keep in mind, this is 25 miles of archival books and material, right?
Yeah, an amazing library,
and the trustees, and the institution itself, and she won on a technicality. She
It's
was up against the most formidable cross-examiner,
yeah,
who was the attorney general, and he was a trustee of the museum because the museum is a part of the
right.
government. It's funded by the government, and so. And she won on a technicality. And the only solace that the head librarian took, was that it was, it actually prompted a review of the libel law
Hmm.
against libraries, because obviously you can't
Right.
possibly control the books and know what's in every book,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so it refuses them in that way. But technically speaking, at the time, it legally, she was correct, and and rewarded, not much money, and she felt vindicated. So,
Now,
so
there's certainly an irony that Comstock went after her and locked her up for a news article that was mailed across the country, and then she went after the library in England for an article that was mailed across the ocean. Was that?
yes, yes, yes. Because she just shifted gears, and she pivoted into what she wanted, which was respectable. And she lived actually a quiet life as a
Right.
result. So, she lived until she was almost 90,
Yeah.
and she showed up, in the
1927.
UK.
Wild.
Yeah, yeah, I know, almost a full century.
Yeah.
5 years, is that 27? Because I think it was 1923 when women in America finally received the right to vote.
Hmm.
Yes, it was. So she was an absolute anomaly,
Yeah.
because if there's one word that describes her, that bridges her, it's kind of but. So she was a feminist, but she was a, sexual opportunist.
Yeah.
She was a capitalist, but she was the first one, by the way, in her newspaper to run a translated version of Karl Marx's manifesto.
Right.
She was any number of things all at once. So she lived so many different lives,
Yeah.
and she went from rags to riches, from riches to rags. Three times.
Yeah.
It was like this circular, it was, anyway, it
Oh,
is quite a story.
so I want to jump back to that presidential campaign, and you mentioned she was in jail, like on election day and during the heart of the campaign.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
how seriously did the country take that campaign of hers?
It's unfair to suggest that they dismissed it, because she was extremely visible,
Right.
as she ran, during the course of her campaign, and her ideas were very
Mm.
controversial. And so it was not just that she ran, it was that she ran on a platform that was incredibly progressive and
Yes.
forward thinking and very
Yeah.
controversial. So, it included, her suggestion that prostitution should be legal. On the other hand, she was against abortion.
Huh.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
complicated. And she was
Yeah.
complicated. She was not, it was very difficult for me to understand her as a human
Yeah.
being, frankly,
Yeah.
because she was just brazen, and I don't mind that.
Mm.
And she's obviously very brave
Mm.
and stalwart, but she was ruthless too.
Yeah. When did you start researching and writing this book? I'm curious.
Well, so I'm based in London,
Yeah.
or until the end of the year, at which point I'm moving to Paris. I
Sounds
move
nice.
around a lot. I mean, I promise you, I'm not doing, it's not drug dealing or anything, but I do move around a lot. And I was here locked down. COVID here was really quite no nonsense.
Yeah.
I mean, you were really locked down
Yeah.
for almost years. And so I was on my own, actually finishing, my previous book was this book on Leonardo da Vinci's portrait lady with an ermine.
Hmm.
And as we went through several iterations of being locked down
Sure.
here.
Sure.
So there was a very severe lockdown where you literally got an hour out every day. And there
Right.
were police, I don't live far from Regent's Park. There were police on horseback who, if they saw you with more than one person, would come by and, and tell you to go home or something. It was very no
Yeah.
nonsense. And all the while Boris Johnson was having parties, but the rest of us were incredibly responsible. And it was quite serious, obviously. I'm not making light of it for a moment.
Right.
But so there was a break before then we went into another lockdown. And during the course of that break, obviously everybody was masked up. And, I've been always a big supporter of the British Museum and a big fan of it. And they were kind enough, to suggest that if I'd like, I could come by and the librarian would allow me into the reading room, which I don't, there's no reason for anybody to know this, but if you've ever been to the British Museum, you go into this huge, lobby space, but in the middle of it is this enormous dome.
Yes.
And under that dome are 25 miles of, what were books that were then moved to the new British Museum. Left behind were items that were not books. They were postcards from Brian Stoker or literally Karl Marx or wonderful. There was the shell of an incendiary bomb that had come through the
Oh my gosh, from the Blitz.
British museum. Yeah, there was just the most kooky items there. So I'm, and I just said, well, this is pretty great, right?
Yeah.
So, and I was kind of looking around. There were no books on the shelf, but there were these beautifully kind of vellum, egg blue color vellum, folios, and on the spine was Woodhull versus the British Museum. And I asked the librarian, who is completely wonderful, but very serious, is just, and I appreciate that. I mean, this is her work.
Yes.
And she looked at me and said, well, that was another American woman, as though somehow I was representing this kind of out of control component of, everything onerous. And she didn't know much about it. She just knew that this woman caused an enormous kerfuffle. And there was this lawsuit, and it was a very, and so at that point, I asked to see, the archives. I was and there was, in beautiful cursive blue ink was the transcript.
Yes. Yeah.
And is that this woman was just absolutely without gumption and fear. And you could read her, defending herself and attacking this, at every turn, preventing the cross-examination. And then I started to snoop around, and there wasn't really much about her. I mean, she was described as, and understandably applauded as a feminist, but she was more than that, and she wasn't that all the time, by the way. So, I thought it was worth, because as I said, when we began our conversation, I'm interested in something I don't understand or I'm unaware of. And in my best efforts, what I try to do is, convey this in a way where I am looking at at what has transpired, and I'm bringing the reader along with me. I'm discovering along with the reader who this woman was. And the vehicle I used was the narrative vehicle was this poor, kind of Mr. Peepers, librarian who was so staggered by it all that he started to research even after the trial, because he was convinced, he didn't know how, but she was some sort of weird threat that was kind of circling around because she was based in London. So that was my intention.
Which means that you were working on this through a presidential election where a woman was running to become the president of the United States.
Yes, the second time.
Kamala Harris. Yeah. And I'm curious, what did it feel like to write this book while that was going on, and the twists and turns of that campaign? And did it have any impact on how you researched or wrote your book?
Yeah, it didn't, but it was, things are, at the risk of sounding glib, what you realize when you research historical books is that it frankly is so much more cyclical than you think it is. So it's not, it's kind of the same it's the same song, but a different verse. So actually, I was writing a book on modern morality when Trump was running for president the first time around. And that was really interesting because that absolutely spoke on behalf of any number of things, which was, and this time I was writing it, or finished it, when during the Trump's second, I loathe to call it a victory, but that he was voted,
His second
into,
campaign, yeah.
Yeah, the second, and it did. The one thing I did wonder about, frankly, was, I mean, there are almost 50 other countries, Western countries, that have voted for a woman leader, whether it's prime minister or president.
Mexico
And
did it last year,
yes, that's right. And so I cannot help but wonder what it will take for America to vote for a woman who, presumably is capable. Obviously, it's somebody who deserves to be voted for. But, I'm not quite sure. I genuinely, I'm not being coy about it. I'm not quite sure what it'll take.
Yeah. What do you see as the lessons in leadership that we can learn from Victoria Woodhull?
Well, I suppose that there's a persistency that one can't help but admire. Yeah. She was imaginative. Yeah. When she was up against a challenge, she would outwit it with something actually quite innovative. And I think that she, if you think about her political platform, all of those issues, have repeated themselves. Some of which have not entirely, have been resolved or successfully addressed. So if you think of what she was proposing, when she was proposing it as a woman who had to create her own platform and voice, that I think that is, in an accumulative sense, that is her legacy. She's known as the first woman who ran for president, but that's kind of a throwaway.
Right.
That she was
like, what's
much
the
more.
deeper legacy of Victoria Woodhull?
Well, I think it's her progressive agenda and the fact that she was quite determined to convey it, regardless of her own her own self interest. I think that it's if you look at what she was proposing and how long it took then to address those issues that are some of them are commonsensical and others are still very forward thinking. I mean, she proposed, something that exists here, which I believe is admirable, although it's underfunded, which is national health care.
Yes.
She proposed an 8-hour workday. As I said, she proposed also divorce laws. I mean, she started with the logical platform of, if you are abused, you, as a woman in a marriage, you should be able to be released from that by way of a divorce. And then once you're on your own, you should be able to earn a living to support yourself. And so those were, completely logical, but at the time, provocative, proposals. And so, I just, if you look at the totality of her, she is remarkable, and I think that's her legacy. But to appreciate her in total, you have to look at it all.
If you've enjoyed this interview with Eden and want to learn more about Victoria Woodhull, please pick up her book from your favorite bookstore, Victoria Woodhull, Suffrage, Free Love, and the First Woman to Run for President. Thank you for your time, Eden.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If there are other historians or authors you'd like to hear from, drop me a line at abridgedpresidentialhistories@gmail.com. I can't promise how quickly I'll get to them. I'm a busy dad of a toddler these days, but if someone looks like a good fit, I'll reach out to them. Thanks again. Take care out there.